Of course, communication is key, but if you and your partner are struggling to communicate effectively, especially during your separation, it's a really big problem. So please tell me, Diane, how can separated parties effectively communicate during their separation?
Look, there's 4 things. First of all, speak to the other person or communicate in a way that's positive. Be positive with your interactions. The second thing is, don't be derogatory. Don't call the other person names. And also, no pointing of fingers. The third thing is, make sure you're mindful of how you are communicating. If you're communicating via text, via messenger, via email, that's a written form of communication. And ultimately speaking, the way in which you're writing it, it may not be read in that way by the other person. So be mindful of how you're writing, and if someone else was reading it, is it nasty? Does it come across as being nasty? And finally, address the issue. Look at what needs to be resolved and resolve that issue. And don't write other things that may come across as being nasty or derogatory.
Because it is hard, isn't it? You know, especially when it's a stressful time. Things can be misconstrued when it's just, you're just trying to be matter of fact. And because there's sometimes no emotion from one partner and the other one's being way more emotional, I guess it can make it difficult, especially during the written word is very strong, but it can be misconstrued.
Absolutely. And what people have to be mindful of is the fact that what they're writing themselves and how they're reading it, the other person may not construe it in that way. So they need to really read it and think, if I was reading this and didn't know the background, or if I put in capital letters, that's generally shouting.
Yes.
But to one person who's writing it, they may not know that or be aware of that, but to the other person, it's shouting at them.
So it's probably best to sleep on it before you reply sometimes. Don't drink and text, or whatever they say.
Absolutely. Instantaneous communication, which is the way we communicate today, is actually sometimes detrimental to a person, particularly going through this situation, such a traumatic time. They're emotional, they're not thinking straight at times, so someone sends a text and they just fire one straight back.
Yeah.
They just need to be mindful of it, take a step back, have a breather and think, is this addressing the issue? Is this positive? Should I be saying these things?
Yes, great advice there. So are there ways in which communication can be used as evidence during a trial?
If we are talking about evidence itself, it may mean that the parties are in the court process. Obviously, the court process itself isn't a process that people want to find themselves in during this really traumatic time. But there is ways that it can be. If you write an email, if you send a text message, people refer to that in their court applications and court material. A judge will read it. If you're nasty to your former partner, a judge will read that you've been nasty.
And you can record phone calls that you've had as well, and that can be used as well. So
and yes, it can be used. There are certain rules that relate to the court system that need to be fulfilled if it is to be used, as in if a person records their own conversation. But what people have to be mindful of is when they're having these communications, they shouldn't be yelling, they shouldn't be screaming. And if they are, then perhaps consider, I'm going to take a step back, hang up the telephone, and we'll have this conversation tomorrow when we're both in a better space and in a better frame of mind.
Very smart advice again. So what about toxic relationships? How can people in this situation communicate in a way to stop it from getting worse? Because that's often what happens. It just gets worse and worse and worse and worse.
Unfortunately, in really toxic relationships, ultimately communication, it may very well be used in a negative way because there has been a toxic relationship. So communication is used in a negative way as opposed to a positive way. Those 4 key points: addressing the issue, being positive. In those sorts of relationships, I think people need to step back and look at the communication, or if they look at the text message or the email and they think, oh, should I send this? Probably don't send
it.
In toxic relationships, if we're not addressing the issue, or if they're not addressing the issue, what they should be doing is saying, okay, I'm going to take a step back, or I'm going to say to the person, I'm not going to respond to that right now because I'm just not in the right frame of mind to. That's far better than responding with a very negative response and then ultimately it being used or a person referring to it in due course, particularly if it's going to be used as evidence against them. Just take a step back and say, I can't respond right now. I'm really not dealing with this, but
I've got your email, I've heard you,
and I will respond ultimately.
Yeah. Or even have someone you can bounce it off as well, someone that's a bit neutral that you can pass things through, because often, you know, if your best friend's reading it, she might be a bit too involved though, but it's having someone that's a bit neutral, I guess, that you can pass things through as well sometimes.
And look, ultimately, people are emotionally involved, they're emotionally engaged, and what they should be doing is taking a step back and saying, if I wasn't so involved, would I be saying this? If I wasn't so engaged, would I be saying this? So yes, a best friend probably is not the best person, but other people who may look at it with fresh eyes and say, well, you know, I wouldn't say that, or yeah, that's okay, but I'd probably say it differently because I read it different to how you've just told me.
Yes.
So that context issue again.
There you have it. So when you and your partner have come to this decision to separate, the chances are that communication between you both might have been already an issue. So if troubles persist, definitely contact Ruhl Family Law for expert legal advice on these matters, and try and keep positive with your communication. That's the #1 tip.